Everyone has used Uber at some point. Whether it's after a concert, a night out, or a long flight, most people don't think twice before opening the door and getting inside. After all, you check the license plate, confirm the driver's name, and trust that the app knows exactly where you're supposed to be. But every now and then, people step into the wrong car, and sometimes they don't realize it until it's far too late. These are 5 wrong Uber horror stories that felt a little too real. Story 1. The driver was still waiting. David Carter was 21 years old and studying at the University of Texas in Austin. One Friday night, after attending a friend's birthday party downtown, he decided to head home early. It was already after midnight, and after spending several hours around loud music and too many people, he just wanted to get back to his apartment and sleep. His friends stayed behind, but David stepped outside the bar alone and ordered an Uber. The app estimated the driver would arrive in 3 minutes. While waiting on the sidewalk, David checked a few messages, glanced up at the passing traffic, and eventually noticed a black Toyota Camry pulling over directly in front of him. The driver rolled down the passenger window and asked if he was David. Relieved, David confirmed his name and climbed inside. The driver looked to be in his 40s. He had short dark hair, wore glasses, and spoke with a calm voice. Nothing about him seemed unusual. In fact, he was friendlier than most rideshare drivers David had encountered. As they pulled away from downtown Austin, the man asked if David had enjoyed his night. David admitted he was exhausted, and the driver laughed, saying that college students always looked half dead after midnight. For the next 20 minutes, the two made casual conversation. They talked about football, the miserable traffic around Austin, and even agreed that parking prices near the university had become ridiculous. David remembered thinking that the man reminded him of one of his old high school teachers. The ride felt completely normal. Eventually, David noticed something strange. The driver's phone wasn't mounted on the dashboard. Most Uber drivers had their phones sitting right beside the steering wheel, displaying maps and directions. But this man didn't seem to be using anything. In fact, David hadn't seen him glance at a screen once since entering the vehicle. At first, David assumed he simply knew the city well enough not to need directions. But after several minutes, curiosity got the better of him. He casually asked whether the app had been acting up lately. The driver looked confused. Then he smiled and admitted he didn't know much about apps. According to him, his daughter usually handled all that technology stuff because he wasn't very good with phones. David laughed politely, but something about the answer felt odd. How could an Uber driver dislike using phones? The thought lingered in the back of his mind, but eventually he brushed it aside. Maybe the man had an older setup. Maybe he used voice navigation. There had to be an explanation. About 5 minutes later, David's phone vibrated. Without thinking, he pulled it from his pocket and immediately felt his stomach tighten. Because according to the Uber app, his driver was still 2 minutes away. David stared at the screen, then looked up at the road, then back down at the screen. The app showed a small car icon approaching his pickup location downtown. His trip hadn't even started. For several seconds, David simply sat there frozen, convinced the app had glitched. Then his phone vibrated again. A message had arrived from his driver. According to the notification, the driver had arrived outside the bar and was asking where David was. David slowly lowered the phone, and for the first time since climbing into the car, he noticed something he somehow hadn't questioned before. The man driving him had never once asked where he was going. Yet somehow, he hadn't taken a single wrong turn. David stared at the notification, hoping it was some kind of delay or glitch. Apps messed up all the time. Maybe the driver's phone had frozen. Maybe the trip had not updated properly. There had to be a simple explanation. But as he watched the little car icon on the screen moving closer to the bar where he had been picked up, another message arrived. The driver apologized for the delay and explained that traffic had slowed him down. He then asked if David was still waiting outside. The message had been sent less than 10 seconds earlier. David felt a cold sensation spread through his chest. Slowly, he looked over at the man driving. The driver seemed completely relaxed. One hand rested on the steering wheel while old country music played quietly through the speakers. The man even smiled when he noticed David looking his way and casually asked if everything was all right. Trying to stay calm, David simply nodded. His mind raced. The man had known his name. He had stopped right in front of the bar. And somehow, despite never asking for directions, he was driving straight toward David's apartment. None of it made any sense. David quietly opened Google Maps on his phone and checked their location. They were less than 5 minutes away from his apartment complex. Somehow, the stranger had been heading to the exact address without ever speaking about it. Then another thought entered David's head. His home address was saved inside the Uber app. He had never said it out loud. Trying not to panic, David decided to call Ryan, one of his friends from the party. The second Ryan answered, David attempted to keep his voice calm and explain the situation. At first, Ryan laughed, assuming David was joking, but the laughter quickly disappeared when David explained that his actual Uber driver was still messaging him. Ryan immediately told him to get out of the car. David quietly agreed. But there was a problem. They were now on the freeway. There was nowhere to stop. Ryan told him to call the police if necessary, but before David could answer, the driver suddenly spoke. The man apologized and said he hoped David wasn't talking about him. David froze. His blood ran cold, because Ryan had been speaking quietly through wireless earbuds. There was absolutely no way the driver should have known what the conversation was about. Trying to remain calm, David quickly ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The man simply smiled and assured him that there was nothing to worry about. He explained that people often became nervous late at night, especially after parties, and said that they would be arriving soon. David spent the rest of the journey staring out the window. Less than 4 minutes later, the car entered his apartment complex. The driver slowed to a stop outside David's building. Everything looked normal, almost too normal. David quickly grabbed the door handle, thanked the man out of instinct, and stepped outside. Before he could even close the door, the driver wished him a good night and calmly drove away. David stood there breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. His phone vibrated again. The actual Uber driver, still waiting outside the bar. According to the app, David had never left. He immediately canceled the ride and went upstairs, trying to convince himself that somehow he had overreacted. Maybe the man had been another rideshare driver. Maybe he had mistaken David for another passenger. There had to be an explanation. But around 30 minutes later, while getting ready for bed, David received a new notification. Not from Uber. A text message. There was no number attached. No contact name. Just a single message. It simply thanked David for the conversation and mentioned how nice it had been discussing football and parking prices with him. David felt his stomach drop. Because he had never given the man his phone number. His hands shaking, he opened the message. And that's when he noticed something even worse. Attached beneath the text was a photograph. It had clearly been taken through the windshield during the drive. It showed David sitting in the passenger seat, looking down at his phone, smiling, completely unaware, and reflected faintly in the side window beside him. The driver's seat was empty. Story 2. Wrong name. Sarah Mitchell had spent the entire day traveling. After attending a work conference in Denver, Colorado, she had finally landed at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago shortly after 11 at night. By the time she collected her luggage and walked outside into the cold air, she felt completely exhausted. All she wanted was a hot shower and a bed. She ordered an Uber and sat on a bench near the pickup area while waiting for the driver to arrive. The app showed that her driver was named Carlos. According to the profile, he drove a silver Honda Accord and had completed over 4,000 trips. His rating was nearly perfect. Within minutes, the app notified her that he had arrived. Looking up from her phone, Sarah immediately spotted a silver Honda pulling toward the curb. The license plate matched. Without thinking twice, she grabbed her suitcase and climbed inside. The driver looked to be in his 30s. He smiled politely and greeted her before pulling away from the airport. Nothing seemed unusual. He drove carefully, kept the music low, and occasionally asked simple questions about whether she was visiting Chicago or returning home. Everything felt completely normal. For the first 15 minutes, Sarah barely paid attention to anything. She was tired and half asleep, occasionally glancing at messages while watching the city lights pass by outside the window. Then she noticed something strange. Mounted beside the dashboard was a phone, but it wasn't displaying Uber. At first, she assumed it was another navigation app, but after looking more closely, she realized it wasn't. The screen displayed a completely different interface. There was no Uber logo, no passenger name, no route information, just a plain map with a blinking blue dot. Sarah frowned. Maybe the driver simply preferred another app for navigation. That had to be it. But something about it bothered her. She quietly opened her Uber app. According to the app, everything looked normal. Her driver was still Carlos. Her trip was still active, and they were heading toward her apartment. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Trying not to sound awkward, she casually asked the driver how long he'd been working for Uber. The man smiled. According to him, he had been driving people around Chicago for almost 12 years. Sarah nodded. Then she asked another question. She wanted to know if business had been busy lately. Again, the driver answered naturally. Nothing about his behavior seemed strange. Eventually, Sarah decided she was simply overthinking things. Until nearly halfway through the journey, the driver received a phone call. He answered through the car speakers. Sarah wasn't paying attention at first, but then she heard a woman's voice ask where he was. The man apologized and explained that he was finishing up one last trip before heading home. Then the woman laughed and referred to him by name. And the name she used wasn't Carlos. It was Michael. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Slowly, she lowered her phone and quietly asked the driver something she had no reason to ask. She asked him what his name was. The man smiled, and without hesitation, he introduced himself as Michael. Sarah froze, because according to Uber, Michael wasn't supposed to exist. Trying not to panic, Sarah forced herself to smile and pretended that nothing was wrong. Maybe she had misheard the phone call. Maybe Carlos was his middle name. Maybe there was some completely reasonable explanation. But the longer she sat there, the more uncomfortable she became. Very casually, she glanced at the driver's ID hanging near the dashboard. Her blood ran cold. It clearly said Michael Harper. Not Carlos. Not even close. For several seconds, Sarah simply stared at the name badge while trying to process what she was seeing. Then she quickly looked back down at her phone. According to Uber, she was still riding with Carlos. The profile picture even showed a different person, and yet the license plate matched perfectly. Nothing made sense. Trying to remain calm, Sarah quietly sent a text message to her sister Emily. She explained that something felt wrong and shared her location just in case. Emily immediately called her, but Sarah declined the call, not wanting to attract attention. Almost instantly, another message appeared. Her sister told her to get out of the car. The problem was they were driving through downtown Chicago. It was nearly midnight, and they were still 15 minutes away from home. Sarah considered asking the driver to stop, but every time she looked up, he seemed completely normal. He wasn't acting suspicious. He wasn't driving recklessly. In fact, he seemed friendly and relaxed. Then another strange thing happened. Michael suddenly apologized and explained that he would need to take a slight detour because traffic ahead looked bad. Sarah frowned, because according to the Uber app, there wasn't any traffic. In fact, the app still showed the original route. Yet somehow, Michael had already exited the freeway. Sarah immediately sat upright, and then her phone vibrated. It was a notification from Uber. According to the app, they were still traveling on the freeway. Sarah's heart started pounding. She opened Google Maps. The blue dot showed something entirely different. She was nowhere near the route Uber believed she was taking. Panic began taking over. She quickly answered Emily's call. Trying to sound calm, Sarah explained what was happening. Her sister immediately told her to call the police. But before Sarah could answer, Michael suddenly spoke. He apologized and admitted that he hated traffic. Sarah froze, because she hadn't put the call on speaker. Emily's voice was barely audible through the phone pressed against her ear. There was no reason he should have known what they were discussing. Her sister practically screamed at her to get out. At that exact moment, Michael slowed the car and stopped at a red light. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her suitcase, unlocked the door, and jumped out. Several drivers honked their horns as she stumbled onto the sidewalk. Terrified, she ran into a nearby gas station and locked herself inside the bathroom. A few minutes later, the police arrived. By then, the silver Honda was gone. Sarah expected the officers to laugh at her story. Instead, they became confused. Because according to Uber, her driver Carlos had never left O'Hare Airport. In fact, Carlos himself was still sitting in the pickup zone. His account showed that Sarah had never entered the vehicle. 2 hours later, Sarah finally made it home. Shaken and exhausted, she spent the next several days trying to convince herself that she had simply gotten into the wrong car. Maybe Michael had been another rideshare driver. Maybe everything else had just been panic. Eventually, life returned to normal. Until 3 weeks later. Late one evening, Sarah was deleting old photos when she noticed something strange. Her phone contained a picture she didn't remember taking. It showed the inside of a car. The angle suggested the image had been captured from the back seat. At first, she thought it must have been an accidental photo. Then she zoomed in and felt every hair on her body stand up. Because sitting in the driver's seat was Michael, smiling, looking directly into the camera, and reflected in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, exactly where Sarah remembered sitting. Story 3. Picked up twice. Mark Henderson had traveled for work so often that airports barely registered in his mind anymore. At 36 years old, he spent more time inside hotels than he did inside his own apartment in Dallas, Texas. Delayed flights, rental cars, and late-night check-ins had become a normal part of life. So when he landed at Los Angeles International Airport shortly after midnight, he was already thinking about sleep. He ordered an Uber while waiting for his suitcase and headed toward the pickup area outside Terminal 4. Within minutes, the app notified him that his driver had arrived. The driver was named Anthony, black Chevrolet Tahoe, license plate matched. Everything looked normal. Mark climbed inside. The driver greeted him politely and asked how his flight had been. He looked to be in his late 50s, with gray hair and a calm voice that reminded Mark of his father. Nothing about the man felt unusual. In fact, after spending years dealing with awkward rideshare drivers, Mark appreciated how quiet he was. For the next half hour, they barely spoke. The radio played softly, and the city lights slid past outside the window as they made their way toward his hotel. Eventually, the driver asked whether Mark traveled often. Mark admitted that he practically lived inside airports. The older man laughed and mentioned that he'd been driving people around Los Angeles for nearly 20 years. According to him, businessmen were always his easiest passengers because they usually just wanted peace and quiet. Mark agreed. By the time they reached the hotel, he almost felt guilty for how little conversation they'd had. The driver wished him a good night, and Mark thanked him before stepping out onto the sidewalk. Everything about the ride had been completely ordinary, until his phone vibrated. Without thinking, Mark pulled it from his pocket and immediately frowned. According to Uber, Anthony was still arriving. The app showed the black Tahoe 3 minutes away. Mark blinked, then refreshed the app. Nothing changed. His trip hadn't started. In fact, according to Uber, Mark had been standing outside the airport the entire time. He stared at the screen in confusion. Then another notification appeared. Anthony had sent a message. The driver apologized for traffic and explained that he would be arriving shortly. Mark slowly looked back toward the street. The SUV that had just dropped him off was already disappearing around the corner. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Eventually, he convinced himself the app had malfunctioned. Technology failed all the time. Maybe the trip hadn't updated correctly. That had to be it. 3 minutes later, another black Chevrolet Tahoe pulled into the hotel driveway. Mark froze, because the vehicle looked identical. Same model, same color, same license plate. The driver rolled down the window. He smiled politely and introduced himself. Anthony. Mark felt his stomach tighten, because this wasn't the same man. This driver looked younger, at least 15 years younger, and according to him, he had just arrived from the airport. Trying to remain calm, Mark simply stood there staring at the younger driver. At first, he convinced himself that exhaustion was playing tricks on him. It had been a long day. He had spent 6 hours inside airports and airplanes. Maybe he had simply forgotten what the first driver looked like. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The first man had gray hair. This one didn't. The first man had worn glasses. This one wasn't wearing any. And most importantly, Mark remembered the conversation. The older driver had spoken about driving in Los Angeles for nearly 20 years. He had joked about businessmen being easy passengers. This younger Anthony simply smiled and asked if Mark was ready to head to the hotel. Mark slowly replied that they were already at the hotel. The younger driver frowned in confusion. According to him, they had just arrived from the airport. Mark laughed nervously and explained that there must be some mistake. He had already completed the trip, but the driver politely shook his head. According to his app, Mark had never entered the vehicle. In fact, he had been waiting for nearly 40 minutes. Trying to prove it, Mark opened his own app. His stomach dropped. The trip had officially just begun. Mark immediately showed the younger Anthony what had happened. The driver looked genuinely disturbed. He insisted that he had been sitting at LAX the entire time. He had never left the airport. The GPS history inside his app confirmed it. Yet somehow, the route now showed them arriving at the hotel. Neither man understood what they were looking at. Eventually, Anthony suggested contacting Uber support, but Mark was too exhausted to deal with any of it. He apologized for the confusion, tipped the driver, and went inside. Over the next several days, he tried convincing himself that it had simply been some bizarre technical issue. And for a while, that explanation worked. Until 3 weeks later, Mark was flying back into Los Angeles for another conference. The memory had faded enough that he almost laughed about it while waiting for his luggage. Eventually, he ordered another Uber. And when the app displayed the driver's information, Mark nearly dropped his phone. Driver name: Anthony. Black Chevrolet Tahoe. Same license plate. His heart started racing. Immediately, he canceled the ride. Then ordered another. Different driver. Different vehicle. Relieved, Mark climbed inside and spent the entire trip silently staring out the window. When he finally reached the hotel, he noticed something strange. Parked directly across the street sat a black Chevrolet Tahoe. His blood turned cold, because standing beside it was the older Anthony, the original driver. The gray-haired man smiled warmly and gave a small wave. Mark froze, then looked away for only a second. And when he looked back, the SUV was gone. So was the driver. That night, Mark barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, unable to shake the memory, he opened Uber and checked his trip history. His heart stopped, because there weren't 2 rides. There were 3. 1 completed trip from the airport with the older Anthony. 1 completed trip from the airport with the younger Anthony. And 1 trip in between. Same vehicle. Same license plate. Same pickup location. Same destination. Except the driver photo was blank. No picture. No rating. No information. Nothing. The trip duration showed 37 minutes. And according to the timestamp, it had happened at exactly the same time as the other 2 rides. Hands shaking, Mark clicked on the trip details. There were no messages. No route history. No receipt. Nothing except 1 note left by the driver. The note simply thanked Mark for being such a pleasant passenger and mentioned how nice it had been discussing business travel with him. Mark felt his blood run cold, because he had only spoken about business travel with 1 person, the older Anthony. And according to Uber's records, that driver had never picked him up. Terrified, Mark immediately closed the app. But before putting his phone down, something caught his eye. The app was asking him to rate the mystery trip. 5 stars had already been selected, and beneath the stars, someone had already written a review. The review appeared under Mark's account, and according to the timestamp, It had been submitted while he was standing outside the hotel talking to the younger Anthony. The review was short. It simply said, "Excellent conversation. Hope to see you again next month." And at the very bottom, the driver had replied. He thanked Mark once again and promised he'd see him soon. Story 4. The Other Passenger. Ryan Miller and his 4 friends had spent the evening watching a football game in downtown Atlanta. By the time the bars started closing, it was nearly 1 in the morning and everyone was exhausted. They had all known each other since college, and nights like this were becoming increasingly rare now that jobs and relationships had started taking over their lives. Because nobody wanted to drive, Marcus ordered an Uber XL. A few minutes later, a white Chevrolet Suburban pulled up outside the sports bar. Everything checked out. The driver's name was Daniel. The license plate matched. And because the group was laughing and arguing over the game, nobody paid much attention as they piled inside. Ryan sat in the front. Marcus and Kevin squeezed into the middle row. David and Ethan climbed into the back. Or at least, that was what Ryan thought. The ride began normally. Music played softly through the speakers while everyone continued arguing about terrible referee decisions and fantasy football. The driver occasionally laughed along, clearly used to transporting loud groups after midnight. About 20 minutes into the ride, Marcus started complaining that someone kept bumping his seat from behind. David immediately blamed Ethan. Ethan denied it. Kevin joined in and joked that maybe the driver had picked up a ghost. Everyone laughed. Nobody thought anything of it. 10 minutes later, they stopped at a red light. Ryan happened to glance into the rearview mirror, and for a brief second, he frowned. There seemed to be someone sitting between David and Ethan. But before he could focus, the light turned green and the thought disappeared from his mind. The back row was dark. People shifted around constantly. He was probably imagining things. Eventually, Marcus started discussing where everyone would meet next weekend. He casually mentioned that the 5 of them hadn't hung out together properly in months. David laughed, then corrected him. According to David, there were 6 people. Marcus immediately disagreed. Ryan joined the conversation and pointed out that there were only 5 friends. But then Ethan spoke up from the back, and according to him, there had always been 6. The conversation turned into playful confusion. Everyone began counting. Ryan, Marcus, Kevin, David, Ethan. 5. Simple. Yet somehow, Ethan insisted they were forgetting somebody. Nobody could figure out why. Then Kevin jokingly turned around and asked who the mysterious 6th person was. And suddenly, nobody laughed, because sitting in the middle of the back row, between David and Ethan, was another man. He looked to be around their age. Normal clothes, normal haircut, normal expression. And what terrified Ryan most wasn't that the stranger was there. It was that nobody could remember when he had gotten into the car, or why none of them had noticed him. The man simply smiled politely and quietly asked why everyone was staring at him. For several seconds, nobody said a word. The stranger looked just as confused as everyone else. He sat quietly between David and Ethan with a puzzled expression on his face, almost as though he couldn't understand why they were suddenly staring at him. Ryan felt his stomach tighten, because the man wasn't acting suspicious. He wasn't smiling strangely. He wasn't threatening anyone. He simply looked normal. Marcus finally laughed nervously and asked who he was. The man frowned. Then, in a calm voice, he admitted that he thought they were joking. According to him, they had spent the last half hour talking about football together. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because none of them remembered speaking to him. The driver glanced at the mirror and casually asked what was going on. Ryan immediately asked whether he knew the guy sitting in the back. The driver looked confused. He replied that he assumed the man was part of their group. After all, he'd climbed into the car with everyone else. Ryan felt cold, because he knew that wasn't possible. He had watched everyone get inside. There had only been 5 friends. Eventually, the stranger awkwardly introduced himself. His name was Alex, and according to him, he had known them since college. The group exchanged nervous glances. Nobody recognized the name. Nobody recognized the face. Yet Alex looked genuinely hurt by their reactions. He quietly laughed and suggested they must all be drunk. According to him, they had gone to dozens of games together. Road trips, birthdays, tailgate parties. He described memories with incredible detail. Specific restaurants, old girlfriends, embarrassing moments. Every story sounded believable, and somehow, tiny parts of them felt familiar. Not enough to remember, but enough to make Ryan uncomfortable. Eventually, Daniel pulled over into a gas station parking lot. Everyone stepped out. Everyone except Alex. The stranger simply sat there looking confused. Ryan immediately asked the driver whether he remembered picking him up. Daniel looked annoyed. According to him, there had always been 6 passengers. The app even showed 6 seatbelts fastened when they left downtown. Nobody understood how. Marcus insisted they call the police. But before anyone could decide what to do, Alex stepped out of the vehicle. And for the first time, everyone noticed something strange. The man wasn't carrying a phone. No wallet. No keys. Nothing. Just the clothes he was wearing. Ryan asked where his car was. Alex looked confused. According to him, they had all come together. Marcus asked where he lived. Alex gave an address. David immediately froze. Because the address belonged to a vacant lot. Nobody had lived there for almost 20 years. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Alex laughed nervously and suggested they were messing with him again. He pulled out his driver's license, and everyone felt the color drain from their faces. Because the photograph showed the same man. Same name. Same face. But the expiration date had passed almost 15 years earlier. The issue date was even older. According to the license, Alex Turner was 41 years old. Yet standing in front of them was a man who looked no older than 25. Panic spread through the group. Marcus immediately backed away. Kevin wanted to leave. Ryan just stood frozen. And throughout the entire thing, Alex looked increasingly frightened. Eventually, the driver had enough. He demanded everyone get back into the car. Nobody argued. The rest of the ride passed in complete silence. 20 minutes later, they reached Marcus's house. Everyone stepped out, except Alex. The stranger remained seated. Ryan looked back one last time. Alex simply smiled sadly and thanked everyone for the ride. Then Daniel drove away. None of them slept much that night. The following morning, Ryan called Daniel. He needed answers. The driver sounded confused. According to him, there had never been a 6th passenger. In fact, he'd spent most of the trip wondering why the 5 friends kept talking to an empty seat. Ryan nearly dropped the phone. Terrified, he immediately called the others. Every single one of them remembered Alex. The conversations, the license, the gas station, everything. Or at least, they thought they did. Because by that evening, Kevin couldn't remember what Alex looked like. 2 days later, David forgot his name. By the end of the week, Marcus only remembered that there had been somebody else. And a month later, Ryan realized something that made his blood run cold. He couldn't remember why he'd been so frightened. He only knew that something terrible had happened in that Uber. Something involving a 6th passenger. Something important. Desperate for answers, Ryan contacted Daniel one final time. The driver agreed to send him the dashcam footage. Hands shaking, Ryan opened the file. The video showed 5 friends climbing into the Suburban. 5 friends talking. 5 friends laughing. And 5 friends getting out. There was no Alex. No 6th passenger. Nothing. Ryan stared at the footage for nearly an hour. Then finally closed the laptop. Because for the life of him, he couldn't remember why he'd been watching it. And sitting beside the laptop on his desk was a driver's license. Issued 28 years earlier, belonging to Alex Turner, a man Ryan no longer remembered, but someone at some point had placed it carefully inside his wallet. Story 5, canceled. Tyler Brooks was 20 years old and halfway through his sophomore year at the University of Central Florida. Like most college students, he'd lost count of how many Ubers he'd taken. Between football games, parties, and late-night food runs, getting into random cars had become second nature. He always checked the driver's name and license plate, at least most of the time. But after a long night celebrating his friend's birthday in downtown Orlando, he wasn't paying nearly as much attention as he should have been. It was almost 2 in the morning when Tyler ordered an Uber outside a crowded bar. Hundreds of people were standing around waiting for rides, and cars were constantly pulling in and out of the pickup area. The entire place was chaotic. His app estimated 4 minutes. Tyler shoved his phone into his pocket and waited. 2 minutes later, a black Nissan Altima pulled up. The driver rolled down the passenger window and asked if he was Tyler. Relieved, Tyler nodded and climbed inside. The driver looked young, maybe early 30s, and greeted him with a smile. Soft music played through the speakers, and the man joked that downtown Orlando after midnight looked like complete chaos. Tyler laughed and agreed. Nothing about him felt strange. Nothing felt wrong. In fact, Tyler remembered thinking that this was probably one of the friendliest drivers he'd had in months. As they pulled away from the crowds, the driver asked if Tyler had been celebrating something. Tyler explained that it had been his friend's birthday, and the two spent the next 20 minutes casually talking about college football, classes, and how ridiculous rent prices had become. Eventually, Tyler started feeling tired and leaned his head against the window. Then his phone vibrated. Without thinking, he checked the notification and immediately frowned. According to Uber, his driver had canceled the trip. Tyler blinked, then sat upright, because another notification appeared right underneath. The message explained that the driver had waited 5 minutes outside the pickup area and reported that Tyler had never entered the vehicle. Tyler stared at the screen, slowly, confused, because he was very clearly sitting inside a car, and he had been for nearly 20 minutes. Trying not to panic, Tyler refreshed the app. The trip had disappeared completely. According to Uber, he had never left downtown Orlando. His history showed no active ride, no receipt, no driver information, nothing. Tyler quietly laughed to himself, assuming the app had glitched. But then he noticed something strange. The driver didn't have a phone mounted anywhere. No Uber screen, no GPS, no directions, nothing. And for the first time during the entire ride, Tyler realized something unsettling. The man had never once asked where he lived. Yet somehow, they were already turning into Tyler's apartment complex. Trying to stay calm, Tyler convinced himself that the app had simply crashed. It wasn't impossible. Phones glitched all the time. Maybe the ride had disconnected. Maybe Uber's servers were having problems. But as he stared around the car, he couldn't ignore one fact. The driver had never asked for directions, and Tyler had never told him his address. Yet somehow, they were already pulling into the apartment complex. The driver smiled and casually commented that college life seemed exhausting. Tyler forced himself to laugh, but his mind was racing. The man had known his name. He had picked him up outside the bar, and somehow, without ever discussing where he lived, he had brought him directly home. The car came to a stop. Tyler thanked the driver out of pure instinct and stepped outside. Before he could even shut the door, the man wished him a good night and drove away. For several seconds, Tyler simply stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Then his phone rang. The number belonged to his actual Uber driver. Confused, Tyler answered. The driver sounded annoyed. According to him, he had been waiting outside the bar for nearly 10 minutes. He explained that he'd tried calling several times before eventually canceling the ride. Tyler apologized and tried explaining that he had already made it home. Silence followed. Then the driver laughed nervously and asked how that was possible. Because according to Uber, Tyler's phone had never moved from downtown Orlando. His location still showed him standing outside the bar. Tyler immediately ended the call. His hands were shaking. He rushed upstairs, locked the apartment door, and tried convincing himself that he had simply gotten into the wrong car. It was embarrassing, sure, but not impossible. The driver had probably mistaken him for another passenger. That explanation made sense. At least, it did until the next morning. When Tyler checked his bank account, there was no charge, no receipt, no transaction, nothing. According to Uber, the trip had never happened. and according to his banking app, nobody had paid for it. Over the next few days, Tyler tried putting the whole thing behind him. Eventually, he convinced himself that he had somehow imagined the strange parts. The man had probably used another rideshare app. Maybe he'd simply been heading in the same direction. But 3 weeks later, something happened that brought everything back. Tyler was cleaning his apartment when he found a receipt lying underneath the couch. He frowned, because he'd never seen it before. It wasn't from Uber. It wasn't from a restaurant. It was a printed receipt from a gas station. The date was the same night as the birthday party. The time matched the ride home. And written across the bottom in blue ink was a message. It simply thanked Tyler for the conversation and wished him luck with his classes. Tyler felt his blood run cold, because he remembered talking about college. He remembered mentioning exams. But he'd never stopped at a gas station. He immediately turned the receipt over and nearly dropped it, because printed faintly on the back was a photograph. Not a normal photograph, a security camera image, taken inside the gas station. The image showed Tyler standing near the counter, smiling and talking. But nobody stood beside him. Nobody. No driver. No customer. No cashier. Nothing. Tyler was completely alone. Terrified, he drove to the gas station the next day. The place looked exactly the same. He even recognized the counter. Trying to stay calm, he approached the elderly cashier and asked if he could review footage from 3 weeks earlier. The old man frowned. Then his expression changed. Very quietly, he admitted he remembered Tyler. He remembered the young college kid who came in late at night. The one who spent nearly 10 minutes talking to himself while buying a bottle of water. Tyler's blood ran cold, because according to the cashier, there had never been anyone else inside the store. Shaking, Tyler showed him the receipt. The old man stared at it for several seconds, then looked genuinely confused, because the receipt wasn't from his gas station. In fact, his store hadn't used printed receipts in over 6 years. That night, Tyler barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, his phone vibrated. It wasn't an Uber notification. It wasn't a text. It was a rating request. 5 stars had already been selected. Underneath, a review had already been written. According to the timestamp, it had been submitted 20 minutes earlier. The review thanked the driver for the pleasant conversation and mentioned how nice it was meeting someone so friendly. Tyler sat frozen, because he had been asleep 20 minutes earlier. Then he noticed the driver's reply. It simply said, "No problem, Tyler. See you after graduation. If you ever find yourself climbing into a rideshare late at night, do yourself a favor and make sure you're getting into the right car. Some trips are better left canceled." If these stories turned your blood cold, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment with your own unexplainable experiences. Sleep well tonight, if you can.